But now let's turn to the new research from the Times, which has shown that just 41% of Gen Z in Britain say they're proud to be British, and almost half believe the UK is a racist country. I spoke about this with Dr. Jenny Bristow, reader in sociology at Canterbury Christ Church University, and Luca Watson, a 23-year-old political commentator. Yes, he is Gen Z, Gen Z, perhaps if you're from a different generation. He's with Young Voices UK, and I began by asking Dr. Bristow of her first thoughts on the Times research.
Two things, really. I mean, first of all, is just the fact that there seems to be endless polling of Gen Z at the moment, surveys of different qualities. And I think just to say, we should always be very careful about generational research. There's a lot of problems with, are you measuring what people think because they're young or a particular generation? How are the questions framed? What are we reading into, particularly young people, when we do this research? So that's a general kind of rider. I think this particular research, it does chime with findings that have been found elsewhere, also in America, which, speak to a certain kind of cultural truth, I think. And the two things that particularly struck me is the level of cultural pessimism that I think young people have been encouraged to adopt towards not only their country, but just their society, their history, the past, the future. There seems to be this just recurring theme of very low levels of trust, a sense that the past and the people who lived there were a problem, a sense that society at the moment is really awful. I'm a sociologist. I'm obviously quite critical of our society. But, sometimes you think, well, is it really that bad? Is it worse than it's been before? And so I think this is kind of just the main thing that really struck me from this particular survey.
Yeah, Luca, it is a pretty bleak overall picture of the way that Gen Z are feeling about their country. I was quite struck that almost half thought Britain's a racist country, only just over 40% proud to be British, and 50% believing that the UK was stuck in the past. Do you share those views?
I wouldn't share all of those views, but I would say that I don't find these findings surprising at all. The first that you mentioned, though, on racism, I'm surprised it's so few of my generation think Britain is racist, given that essentially every organ of the state, from our education to the state broadcaster to almost every museum and cultural institution, even statues now come with a plaque telling us what a racist country this is. This is what we've been taught our whole lives. And so it's not surprising at all that, given that, people believe what they've been told their whole lives. So I think that I'm surprised it was only 48%, that it's not even higher than that.
Even though, Luca, many of those plaques are there to try to show that the country addresses some of our colonial past and some of the problems associated with that.
Well, that's the intention. And the idea was that bringing all this up, uncovering all this history and this negative history, the racist history and so on, would have a sort of cleansing effect, that once we got it out of our system, once we were honest, we'd all be able to move on. I think what this shows is that it's the opposite, that actually if you constantly dig deeper and deeper to find more and more injustices, people don't feel like, oh, now we can move on. People take those injustices on and they carry them with them, and they start to believe that the whole of society is at fault for these injustices. So I think the strategy, if the strategy over the last decade or so, especially in the last 5 years, was intended to be good for social cohesion, to be good for community relations, race relations, what this suggests is that actually it's done the opposite. It's made the situation worse.
Dr. Jenny Bristow, what do you make of that?
Well, I think Luca raises some very important points there. It's interesting that you have, there has been a big increase in what I would call racialized thinking, where things are seen through the prism of race all of the time. And if you were to ask a question, do you think Britain's a racist country? I don't quite know how it was framed, but I think most people would think, oh, this is a bit of a trap. Are you asking, Is there still racism? Well, yes. Okay. But that doesn't necessarily, I think, mean that, Britain is a racist country overall, or that it's more racist now than it used to be. I mean, it's nothing like Britain in the 1970s. And I think there has been this promotion in the ways that Luca described, actually, of these it's kind of like cultural virtue signalling, which is actually proving very divisive. It encourages people all the time to look for differences and grievances and slights and everything else, rather than to kind of take what would be a much more sensible, rounded historical view and understand that Britain, like every other country, is built on, a history of bad things and good things, right? Progressive things, but injustices, inequalities, all of that. And that as history develops, we move with it, right? And we want to kind of look to make things better in the present day and in the future. Whereas I think this finding really shows the extent to which culturally young people have been encouraged to really see the past as kind of toxic and think that it just informs everything about the moment today. They can't actually see the good things or see the things that have improved over recent history.
Luca, do you think that is what is behind this lack of any sense of pride in the country amongst so many of your generation?
Yeah, I think in part, and just to add to Jenny's point, I'd say it's not just historically, it's not just people are saying that historically there's injustices, it's in the current day. I remember not long ago when state institution after state institution declared themselves institutionally racist, including police forces, Avon and Somerset Police. I remember they announced the Metropolitan Police. So we have every institution, or not every, many institutions publicly saying we are institutionally racist. We've run a report and that's what we found. So, of course, people feel that way. It's just, believing what people are being told. So I think that's part of why there's a lack of faith in the country and loyalty with regards to going to war and so on. But also I do think there is an element which is more material, which is a sense that young people especially feel like they've been hard done by, especially in the last 2 decades or so, that the country's prioritized the needs of older people at the expense of younger people on issues like housing, on issues like where taxation revenue is coming from. It's increasingly squeezed out of the young working age population. So I think that comes into it as well.
Yeah, just on that then, Luca, do you think that the economic factors are really significant here? We know that it's harder than ever to get onto the housing ladder. We've seen a lot of evidence and discussion recently about the way that, for example, pensioners have the increases in their benefits locked in a way that doesn't happen for younger people. Do you think those economic factors are significant?
Absolutely. I think it's a big part of the overall picture. And I think it's more so it just shows where the country's priorities are. And it shows that the country's priorities are not in ensuring that young people have a bright future they can look forward to. And I'd say to older people, look, it's never been easier to defect for us. It's never been easier to move off. Countries like Australia are, begging especially well-qualified people to leave and go there. So I think it's in everyone's interests, young or old, to ensure that the future for young people in this country looks bright, that people want to stay, they want to live the rest of their lives here, and they feel like they can get a stake in the country. And you mentioned property. I mean, that's the best way to make someone feel like they have a real stake in their area, in their country, is being able to own their own home. And unfortunately, for people of my generation, it's just something that seems completely unrealistic at this point.
Jenny, there is a lot of evidence, isn't there, that this generation, Gen Z, are having a much tougher time economically, and that their expectations in terms of wealth and property and so on are very different from, well, dare I say it, my own generation.
Well, I think we have to be very careful about this. I mean, I've written a lot about what I call the narrative of boomer blaming, which is something that, political and cultural elites have seized on for a long time, right? To sort of, it's a grievance narrative, saying to young people, the baby boomers, they stole your future, as David Willits put it so memorably. Apparently, there's a Canadian guy who calls the baby boomers a generation of sociopaths. They're so evil. It's like these older people have taken everything from the young and there's nothing left. Now, I think that is not true for a start. And I think it's also a very dangerous, divisive narrative. Young people are encouraged to sort of see themselves as sort of cut off, estranged, different from older people, and at war with other generations. There are significant economic and political problems. We know that. And yes, so we should be looking at how we work towards making a brighter, kind of more productive future. But you can't do that just for the kids. And it's not true that this is all about older people. It's about kind of deep-seated problems to do with, for example, the completely dysfunctional housing market, or to do with the state of, public welfare services.
Perhaps when we look at the wider findings, it's not surprising, Luca, that Gen Z, very few of them, only 11% say they'd be prepared to fight for Britain. But I wonder if that is to do with the particular circumstances in which you have grown up. I mean, you're a very long way from the wartime generation who felt a direct threat to the country.
Yeah, and the wars we grew up seeing were the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So for us, that is what war is: faraway places where there doesn't seem to be a real direct threat to the United Kingdom, and lots of people being killed or maimed horribly. And ultimately, of course, basically we lost those wars too. So I think it's pretty understandable that people who grew up within that context are not particularly keen to sign up and say they're willing to fight for their country.
Luca, just finally, and it's a big question, but what do you think as a society we should do to make you and others in Gen Z feel a bit more positive about the country?
Probably the easiest thing actually would be to try and address the material issues. I think in a sense that's far easier than the identity and cultural issues, which are much more deeply ingrained. So that just means looking at the issues that we're facing as a generation broadly. So that's housing, that's taxes being quite high for when we start working. It's student debt being a big issue for many people. So try and address those. And then on the cultural side, I think that's where the real difficulty lies. And essentially what we need is to recalibrate exactly what it means to be British, to work out what that identity means, whether it still makes sense in this day and age to speak in those terms. And as I said, that's a project which I think will be far, far more difficult, but one that is necessary ultimately if we want to have a sense of social cohesion and if we want the British nation to survive.
Well, that was Luca Watson from Young Voices UK and Dr. Jenny Bristow from Canterbury Christ Church University speaking to me a little earlier.